The autumn wind carried a chill through the streets of downtown Richmond as the evening light faded into shadows. The city hummed with the usual rhythm of people heading home from work, cars streaming past storefront windows that glowed with warm light. It was the kind of evening that should have been peaceful, ordinary, forgettable. But for Judge Darius Coleman, this night would become seared into his memory forever, not as the observer he had been in countless cases, but as the victim of the very injustice he had spent his career fighting against. Darius walked with purpose down Hamilton Street, his long coat billowing slightly in the breeze. At 38 years old, he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had worked hard for everything he had achieved. His close-cropped hair was beginning to show touches of gray at the temples, and his deep brown eyes held the weight of someone who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Tonight, he was simply a man heading home after a long day at the courthouse, looking forward to a quiet evening with a good book and a cup of coffee. The black leather briefcase in his hand contained case files and legal documents, the tools of his trade as one of Richmond's most respected circuit court judges. His colleagues knew him as fair but firm, compassionate but unwavering in his commitment to justice. The community respected him not just for his position, but for the journey he had taken to get there. Growing up in the same neighborhoods where he now presided over cases, Darius understood the complex dynamics of a system that didn't always serve everyone equally. But on this evening, as he made his way through the streets he knew so well, Darius Coleman would discover that his judicial robes offered no protection against the kind of prejudice that saw only skin color and made assumptions based on centuries of bias and fear. As he turned the corner onto Maple Avenue, Darius noticed the patrol car first. It was moving slowly, the way police cars do when officers are actively looking for something or someone. The vehicle's spotlight swept across storefronts and parked cars, creating moving shadows that danced across the sidewalk where Darius continued his steady pace home. Inside the patrol car, officers Ryan Matthews and Craig Daniels were nearing the end of what had been a frustratingly quiet shift. Both men were looking for action, for the kind of arrests that would justify their aggressive approach to law enforcement and feed their sense of authority over the communities they patrolled. Officer Ryan Matthews sat behind the wheel, his broad shoulders filling out his uniform as his eyes scanned the street through narrowed lids. At 32 years old, Matthews had been on the Richmond police force for 8 years, and his record was peppered with complaints that had been quietly dismissed or overlooked by supervisors more interested in maintaining departmental solidarity than addressing systemic problems. Tonight, like most nights, he was the picture of aggressive law enforcement, always looking for someone to challenge his authority. His partner, Officer Craig Daniels, sat in the passenger seat with the nervous energy of someone who fed off conflict but lacked the confidence to initiate it himself. At 29, Daniels had been Matthews' partner for 3 years, and together they had developed a reputation for being particularly harsh with certain segments of the community. Where Matthews was openly aggressive, Daniels was quietly malicious, the kind of officer who took pleasure in small acts of cruelty when he thought no one was watching. Both officers had appeared in Judge Coleman's courtroom multiple times over the past several years, always as witnesses in cases where their testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case. Each time, Judge Coleman had questioned their procedures with the kind of thoroughness that made it clear he wasn't impressed by their work. His pointed questions during cross-examination had challenged inconsistencies in their reports and exposed gaps in their adherence to constitutional requirements. Neither officer had appreciated the judge's scrutiny, though they had never connected the name on court documents with the face behind the bench during their brief courtroom appearances. To them, Judge Coleman was just another bleeding-heart judge who made their jobs harder by questioning their authority and protecting criminals who deserved whatever treatment they received. Tonight, as Matthews swept the patrol car's spotlight across the sidewalk, it illuminated a tall black man in an expensive coat carrying a leather briefcase. In the harsh glare of the artificial light, Darius Coleman looked like exactly the kind of person that Matthews and Daniels had been trained formally and informally to view with suspicion. "Look at this guy," Matthews said, slowing the patrol car to match Darius's walking pace. "Expensive clothes, fancy briefcase, walking through this neighborhood like he owns the place." Daniels leaned forward to get a better look at the man they were following. "Probably a drug dealer. These guys dress nice to avoid suspicion, but they're all the same underneath." Neither officer considered that the man they were profiling might be a respected member of the community, a federal judge, or someone whose only crime was walking home while black. Their training had taught them to be suspicious of everyone, but their personal biases had taught them to be especially suspicious of black men who appeared successful or confident. Matthews accelerated slightly, pulling the patrol car ahead of Darius before turning on the emergency lights and pulling to the curb. The sudden flash of red and blue lights reflected off storefront windows and parked cars, turning the quiet street into a scene of apparent emergency. Darius felt his heart rate increase as he saw the patrol car's lights activate. His years of experience in the criminal justice system had given him an intimate understanding of how police encounters could escalate, and his personal experience as a black man in America had taught him that even the most innocent situations could become dangerous when racial bias entered the equation. He slowed his pace and considered his options. He could continue walking and hope the officers were responding to some other situation, but the way they had positioned their vehicle made it clear they were interested in him. He could turn around and head in the other direction, but that might be interpreted as flight and could escalate whatever was about to happen. His best option was to continue walking calmly and hope that any interaction would be brief and professional. Matthews and Daniels exited their patrol car with the practiced movements of officers who had done this countless times before. Matthews approached from the front while Daniels positioned himself at an angle that would cut off any potential escape route. Both men had their hands near their weapons, not drawing them but making it clear that they were prepared for violence if they deemed it necessary. "Excuse me, sir," Matthews called out, his voice carrying the kind of artificial politeness that barely concealed underlying hostility. "Can I have a word with you?" Darius stopped walking and turned to face the officers, his movements slow and deliberate. He kept his hands visible and his voice calm, drawing on years of experience in dealing with law enforcement from the other side of the bench. "Good evening, officers," Darius said respectfully. "Is there a problem?" Matthews studied Darius's face in the harsh light of the street lamps, noting his composed demeanor and articulate speech. Rather than reassuring the officer, these qualities seemed to irritate him further. In Matthews' worldview, deference and fear were the appropriate responses to police authority, and Darius's calm confidence suggested someone who didn't understand his place in the social hierarchy. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Matthews said, which was a lie. "Mind telling me what you're doing out here tonight?" Darius felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he witnessed law enforcement overreach from the bench. But now he was experiencing it from the other side, feeling the weight of suspicion and the implicit threat that came with being questioned by armed officers who seemed to have already decided he was guilty of something. "I'm walking home from work, officer," Darius replied, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "I work downtown and live about 6 blocks from here." Daniels stepped closer, his eyes scanning Darius from head to toe with the kind of scrutiny that was designed to intimidate. "What kind of work do you do that requires you to dress so fancy? That's an expensive coat, expensive shoes, expensive briefcase. Seems like a lot of money for someone walking through this neighborhood." The implication was clear. Black men didn't belong in expensive clothes unless they had acquired them through illegal means. Darius felt his jaw tighten, but he maintained his composure, knowing that any display of anger or frustration could be used to justify whatever the officers decided to do next. "I'm a judge," Darius said simply. "Circuit Court Judge Darius Coleman. My identification is in my wallet if you need to verify that information." Both officers exchanged a look that Darius couldn't quite interpret. Matthews stepped back slightly as if considering this new information while Daniels continued his aggressive posturing. "A judge?" Matthews said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "You expect us to believe that?" Darius reached slowly toward his inside coat pocket, moving carefully to avoid any action that might be misinterpreted as threatening. "My identification is right here, officer. Judge Darius Coleman, Richmond Circuit Court." "Keep your hands where we can see them," Daniels barked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Don't reach for anything without permission." The situation was escalating exactly as Darius had feared it would. Despite his calm demeanor and respectful responses, the officers seemed determined to treat him as a criminal. He understood now what so many defendants had tried to explain to him over the years, that compliance and respect meant nothing when officers had already decided you were guilty. Matthews approached closer, his body language becoming more aggressive. "Look, friend, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but impersonating a judge is a serious crime. Why don't you just tell us the truth about what you're really doing out here?" "I am telling you the truth," Darius replied, his voice remaining steady despite his growing frustration. "I am Judge Darius Coleman. I've been on the bench for 5 years. You can verify this information with a simple phone call to the courthouse." Daniels laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the buildings around them. "Right. And I'm the mayor. You're coming with us until we can figure out what your real story is." The absurdity of the situation would have been laughable if it weren't so dangerous. 2 police officers who had appeared in his courtroom multiple times were refusing to believe that he was a judge, despite his offer to provide identification and verification. Their preconceptions about who could and couldn't hold positions of authority were so strong that they literally could not accept the evidence of their own experience. "Officers," Darius said, trying one more time to de-escalate the situation, "I understand your skepticism, but I assure you that I am who I say I am. I've presided over cases in Richmond Circuit Court for 5 years. Some of those cases may have involved your testimony. If you'll just allow me to show you my identification, we can clear this up quickly." Matthews grabbed Darius by the arm, his grip unnecessarily tight and aggressive. "Turn around and put your hands on the car. We're going to search you for weapons and then take you downtown to sort this out." The physical contact crossed a line that Darius had hoped they wouldn't cross. Being stopped and questioned was one thing, but being physically manhandled was another level of violation entirely. He could feel the eyes of passers-by on the street, people slowing down to watch the spectacle of a well-dressed black man being treated like a criminal by 2 white police officers. "Officer, this is unnecessary," Darius said, his voice carrying a note of authority that he couldn't completely suppress despite his vulnerable position. "I am not resisting. I am not armed. I am simply trying to cooperate with your investigation while maintaining my constitutional rights." The mention of constitutional rights seemed to infuriate Matthews further. "Constitutional rights?" he sneered. "You think you can lecture me about the law? Turn around and assume the position before I decide you're resisting arrest." Darius complied, placing his hands flat against the patrol car while Matthews began searching his pockets with movements that were unnecessarily rough and invasive. The briefcase was taken from his hand and set on the ground, its contents spilling slightly onto the sidewalk. Daniels picked up Darius's identification from his wallet, studying it under the harsh light of his flashlight. The Virginia driver's license clearly showed the name Darius Coleman, along with an address in an upscale neighborhood that seemed to surprise both officers. "Well, well," Daniels said, holding up the license. "Darius Coleman, just like he said. But that doesn't prove he's a judge. Could be stolen, could be fake. These guys are getting more sophisticated with their identity theft." Matthews pulled out Darius's business cards from his wallet, each one clearly identifying him as Judge Darius Coleman, Richmond Circuit Court. The cards included the courthouse address, phone number, and official seal of the Commonwealth of Virginia. "Look at this," Matthews said to his partner. but his tone suggested he was still skeptical rather than convinced. Business cards that say he's a judge, but anyone can print business cards. Doesn't prove anything. The willful blindness of the officers was stunning in its completeness. Faced with multiple forms of identification, business cards, and the man's own calm and authoritative demeanor, they continued to insist that he was somehow impersonating a judge for unclear criminal purposes. Darius remained pressed against the patrol car, feeling the humiliation of being searched like a common criminal while people gathered on the sidewalk to watch. Some of the onlookers had their phones out, recording the encounter, which gave him some hope that there would be documentation of whatever happened next. "Officers," Darius said, his voice carefully controlled. "My business cards include the direct phone number to my chambers. You can call that number right now and verify my identity with my clerk, who is still in the office preparing for tomorrow's docket." Matthews ignored the suggestion, continuing his search with increasingly aggressive movements. "You know what I think?" he said loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I think we've got a con man here who's been using fake credentials to run some kind of scam, probably targeting elderly people or small businesses with legal threats." The accusation was so outrageous that Darius almost laughed despite his precarious situation. The idea that someone would impersonate a judge to walk through a residential neighborhood carrying legal documents was absurd, but the officers seemed committed to their narrative regardless of the evidence. Daniels had opened Darius's briefcase and was examining its contents: case files, legal documents, judicial opinions, and correspondence bearing the official seal of the Richmond Circuit Court. Any reasonable person would have recognized these as the legitimate materials of a working judge, but Daniels seemed determined to find something suspicious. "Look at all these official-looking documents," Daniels said, holding up a stack of papers. "Could be forgeries. These identity thieves are getting really good at faking official paperwork." A voice from the crowd called out, "Officers, why don't you just call the courthouse and verify his identity like he suggested?" The speaker was an elderly black woman who had stopped to watch the encounter, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of witnessing police interactions in the community. Matthews turned toward the crowd with obvious annoyance. "Ma'am, this is police business. We know how to conduct our investigation without advice from civilians." The woman didn't back down. "That man has been respectful and cooperative. He's offered to let you verify his identity. Why are you treating him like a criminal?" Other voices in the crowd began to murmur agreement, and Darius could see that the officers were becoming uncomfortable with the attention their actions were receiving. In the age of cell phone cameras and social media, police encounters were increasingly subject to public scrutiny, and these officers were creating exactly the kind of scene that generated negative publicity for law enforcement. Matthews made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Rather than taking the simple step of calling the courthouse to verify Darius's identity, he chose to escalate the situation further. "Turn around," Matthews ordered, reaching for his handcuffs. "You're under arrest for impersonating a public official, identity theft, and obstruction of justice." The charges were completely fabricated, with no basis in fact or law, but Matthews was beyond caring about such details. In his mind, this well-dressed black man had challenged his authority by refusing to accept the role of criminal suspect, and now he would face the consequences of that challenge. Darius felt the cold metal of the handcuffs click around his wrists, the sound echoing in his ears like a gavel falling in a courtroom. "Officer, you are making a serious mistake. I am Judge Darius Coleman, and this arrest is completely unjustified. You have no probable cause, no evidence of criminal activity, and no legal authority to detain me." Matthews pushed Darius toward the patrol car with unnecessary force. "Save the legal lecture for someone who cares. You picked the wrong cops to run your scam on tonight." As Darius was placed in the back seat of the patrol car, he looked through the window at the crowd of onlookers who had gathered to witness his humiliation. Some of them were still recording with their phones, and he hoped their documentation would eventually help expose the injustice of what had just occurred. The patrol car pulled away from the curb with Darius sitting in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind his back and his mind racing through the legal and professional implications of what had just happened. In less than 30 minutes, he had gone from being a respected federal judge walking home from work to being a criminal suspect arrested on fabricated charges by officers who refused to believe his identity. The irony was not lost on him that these were likely the same officers whose testimony he had questioned so thoroughly in his courtroom. Their willingness to lie and fabricate charges was now being directed against him personally, giving him a first-hand understanding of the injustices he had only witnessed from the bench. As the patrol car made its way toward the Richmond City Jail, Darius began to consider the steps he would need to take to clear his name and hold these officers accountable for their misconduct. But first, he would have to survive the booking process and whatever other indignities awaited him as just another black man caught in the machinery of a criminal justice system that too often served the powerful at the expense of the powerless. The man who had spent his career dispensing justice was about to experience injustice from the other side, and the lessons he learned would change not only his own perspective, but the lives of everyone who would appear in his courtroom in the years to come. 24 hours later, Judge Darius Coleman sat in the holding cell at Richmond City Jail, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his judicial composure tested by a night that had stripped away every assumption he had held about his place in society. The concrete walls around him were covered with graffiti left by countless previous occupants, each mark a testament to the human cost of a system that processed people like products on an assembly line. The cell smelled of disinfectant, fear, and desperation. Darius had sentenced hundreds of people to time in facilities like this one, but he had never truly understood the psychological impact of incarceration until he experienced it himself. The loss of freedom, the constant noise, the dehumanizing treatment by guards who saw him as just another inmate, all of it combined to create an experience that was both educational and traumatic. His cellmate was a young man named Marcus, who had been arrested for drug possession and was awaiting arraignment. Marcus had been surprised to find himself sharing space with someone who looked like a businessman, rather than the usual collection of street criminals and addicts who cycled through the system. "What they get you for?" Marcus had asked when Darius was first brought to the cell. "They say I was impersonating a judge," Darius replied, the absurdity of the charge still difficult to accept even after repeating it multiple times to booking officers, guards, and anyone else who would listen. Marcus had laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but Darius's serious expression made it clear that this was not a humorous situation. "Man, that's wild. But why would anybody want to pretend to be a judge? That's like pretending to be a tax collector or something." Over the course of the night, as they talked to pass the hours until morning, Darius found himself telling Marcus about his life and career, partly to maintain his own sanity, and partly because he needed to hear his own voice speaking the truth after hours of being told he was lying about his identity. Darius Coleman's journey to the bench had begun 38 years earlier in a modest house 3 miles from where he now sat in jail. The youngest of 3 children, he had been raised by his grandmother Rosa Coleman after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7 years old. Rosa Coleman was a woman of quiet strength who had worked 2 jobs to keep her family together while instilling values that would guide them through whatever challenges life presented. The neighborhood where Darius grew up was in transition during his childhood, caught between the promise of urban renewal and the reality of economic decline. Some blocks featured well-maintained homes owned by families who had lived there for generations, while others showed the signs of disinvestment and neglect that marked so many American cities during the 1980s and 1990s. Rosa Coleman had been determined that her grandchildren would not become statistics, casualties of a system that seemed designed to limit their opportunities. She enrolled them in the best schools she could find, volunteered at their activities, and created a home environment that emphasized education, respect, and personal responsibility. "Every door that opens for you," she would tell young Darius as they sat at the kitchen table working on homework, opens a little wider for the next person. You don't just succeed for yourself, you succeed for all of us. Those words had shaped every decision Darius made as he navigated the educational system that would eventually lead him to law school and the bench. In elementary school, he was often the only black child in advanced classes, learning early to navigate environments where his presence was noted and sometimes resented by parents who thought diversity programs were taking opportunities away from their own children. High school had presented different challenges. Darius excelled academically while watching friends and neighbors fall victim to the twin traps of drugs and violence that claimed so many young black men of his generation. He learned to walk the line between academic success and street credibility, earning the respect of both teachers and peers while never forgetting the lessons his grandmother had taught him about staying focused on long-term goals. College had been Darius's first real taste of the world beyond Richmond. At the University of Virginia, he encountered young people from backgrounds vastly different from his own. Students whose parents were lawyers, doctors, and business executives who took success for granted rather than fighting for every opportunity. Darius worked multiple jobs to pay for school while maintaining grades high enough to qualify for law school, learning to navigate social and academic environments where his presence was sometimes welcomed and sometimes merely tolerated. Law school had been a revelation. For the first time, Darius found himself in an environment where his experiences and perspectives were valued rather than simply endured. His professors recognized that his background gave him insights into the criminal justice system that complemented the theoretical knowledge being taught in classrooms. His constitutional law professor, Dr. Patricia Harrison, had been particularly influential in shaping his understanding of the law as both a tool for justice and a weapon for oppression. The Constitution, she would tell her students, is only as strong as the people who interpret and enforce it. Every generation must decide whether they will use the law to expand freedom or to maintain existing power structures. Those words resonated deeply with Darius, who had seen firsthand how the legal system could be used to either protect or persecute people based on their race, class, and social status. He threw himself into his studies with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was power and power was the only way to create lasting change. After graduating near the top of his class, Darius had spent 15 years practicing law before his appointment to the bench. He started as a public defender, representing clients who couldn't afford private attorneys and who often faced a system that seemed designed to convict rather than seek justice. The work had been challenging and often heartbreaking. Darius represented teenagers charged with drug possession who faced years in prison for mistakes that wealthy kids in different neighborhoods might receive probation for. He defended men and women whose encounters with police had escalated far beyond what the circumstances warranted, often because officers brought their own biases and assumptions to interactions with black citizens. One case in particular had shaped his understanding of how racial bias infected every level of the criminal justice system. His client, a young man named David Washington, had been charged with armed robbery based solely on a cross-racial identification by a victim who had seen the perpetrator for less than 30 seconds in poor lighting conditions. Despite alibis and evidence suggesting his innocence, Washington had been convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. Darius had appealed the conviction, arguing that the identification was unreliable and that his client's constitutional rights had been violated during the investigation. The appeal had been successful, but only after Washington had served 3 years for a crime he didn't commit. The experience had taught Darius that the system's capacity for injustice was matched only by its reluctance to acknowledge and correct its mistakes. The transition from defense attorney to prosecutor had been a strategic decision rather than a philosophical one. Darius understood that real reform required people with integrity working within every level of the system. including the prosecutor's office that was responsible for deciding which cases to pursue and how aggressively to pursue them. As a prosecutor, Darius had earned a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who pursued convictions aggressively when the evidence supported them, but who was equally willing to dismiss charges when they were not justified by the facts. He had clashed with police officers who expected him to rubber stamp their arrests regardless of the quality of their investigations, and he had earned the respect of defense attorneys who knew he could be trusted to honor his ethical obligations. The appointment to the bench had come after 10 years as a prosecutor and 5 years in private practice, where Darius had built a reputation as one of Richmond's most respected attorneys. Governor Patricia Reynolds, a moderate Democrat who had made judicial diversity a priority, had chosen him for a vacancy on the Richmond Circuit Court after an extensive vetting process. The confirmation process had been intense but ultimately successful. Darius had answered questions about his judicial philosophy, his approach to criminal sentencing, and his commitment to fairness with the careful precision of someone who understood that every word would be scrutinized by legislators looking for reasons to oppose his appointment. Conservative legislators had questioned whether his background as a public defender would make him too sympathetic to criminal defendants, while liberal legislators had wanted assurance that he would be tough on police misconduct and racial bias. Darius had navigated these concerns by emphasizing his commitment to following the law, regardless of his personal feelings about particular cases or outcomes. "My job as a judge," he had told the confirmation committee, "is not to advocate for any particular outcome, but to ensure that everyone who appears in my courtroom receives a fair hearing based on the evidence and the law. Justice is not about protecting the powerful or empowering the powerless, but about applying legal standards consistently regardless of who is involved." The confirmation had passed by a comfortable margin, and Darius had taken the bench with a clear understanding of the responsibility he carried. He was not just Judge Coleman, he was also a symbol of possibility for young people who looked like him and came from similar backgrounds. Every decision he made would be scrutinized not just for its legal merit, but for what it said about his fitness to serve and the wisdom of increasing diversity on the bench. Over his 5 years as a judge, Darius had developed a reputation as someone who came prepared to court every day and expected the same from everyone who appeared before him. His legal rulings were well-researched and rarely overturned on appeal. His sentencing decisions were proportionate and took into account both the severity of crimes and the circumstances of individual defendants. But it was his handling of cases involving police misconduct that had earned him the most attention from both supporters and critics. Darius brought a unique perspective to these cases, understanding both the challenges faced by law enforcement officers and the constitutional rights that limited their authority. He was tough on officers who lied or exceeded their authority, but he was equally tough on defendants who committed actual crimes regardless of any misconduct by police. His approach had not always been popular with law enforcement. Officers like Ryan Matthews and Craig Daniels, who had appeared in his courtroom multiple times, had found their testimony subjected to the kind of scrutiny that other judges might have avoided. Darius asked pointed questions about their procedures, challenged inconsistencies in their reports, and made it clear that their badges did not make them immune from accountability. Neither Matthews nor Daniels had ever connected the judge who questioned their testimony with the name Darius Coleman that appeared on court documents. They knew only that some judges were easier to testify before than others, and Judge Coleman was definitely not one of the easy ones. Now, sitting in a jail cell wearing the same expensive suit he had worn to court the previous day, Darius was experiencing the criminal justice system from a perspective he had never imagined possible. The booking process had been a masterclass in dehumanization designed to strip away dignity and individuality in favor of processing efficiency. The booking officer had been skeptical when Darius insisted on his right to make a phone call, explaining that he needed to contact his chambers to inform them that he would not be in court the following day. The officer had initially refused, claiming that judges didn't get arrested and that Darius's story was obviously fabricated. It had taken 3 hours and the intervention of a supervisor before Darius was finally allowed to contact his clerk, Janet Morrison, who had worked with him for 4 years and immediately recognized his voice despite the unusual circumstances. "Judge Coleman?" Janet had said, her voice filled with confusion and concern. "Where are you calling from? Your first case is scheduled for 9 a.m. and there are attorneys here asking about the delay." "Janet," Darius had said, trying to keep his voice calm and professional, "I need you to clear my calendar for today and possibly tomorrow. I've been arrested by Richmond police officers who refuse to believe my identity, and I'm being held at the city jail on completely fabricated charges." The silence on the other end of the line had lasted so long that Darius wondered if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Janet had found her voice. "Judge, this has to be some kind of mistake. Should I contact Chief Judge Stone? Should I call an attorney?" "Yes to both," Darius had replied. "Call Judge Stone immediately and explain the situation. Then contact David Martinez at the ACLU and ask him to represent me at arraignment. Tell him exactly what happened and ask him to bring media attention to this case if necessary." The call had been monitored by jail personnel, as all inmate calls were, and within an hour word had begun to spread through the facility that they were holding someone who claimed to be a judge. The reaction had been mixed, with some guards expressing skepticism and others beginning to worry about the potential consequences of holding a member of the judiciary. Marcus, his cellmate, had listened to Darius's account of his career with growing amazement. "So you're really a judge?" he had asked. "Like for real?" "For real?" Darius had confirmed. "And tomorrow, assuming I can get out of here, I'll probably be back in my courtroom hearing cases just like yours." Marcus had been quiet for a long time after that, processing the implications of sharing a cell with someone who normally sat on the other side of the legal system. Finally, he had spoken again. "Judge, can I ask you something? Do you really believe the system works? I mean, after what happened to you last night?" It was a question that Darius had been asking himself since the handcuffs had clicked around his wrists. His faith in the system had been built on the assumption that truth and justice would ultimately prevail, that good people working within the system could make it fair and effective. But his arrest had been based on lies, conducted by officers who had refused to consider evidence that contradicted their preconceptions, and processed by a system that seemed designed to assume guilt rather than innocence. "Marcus," Darius had replied after careful consideration, "I still believe the system can work, but only if people are willing to hold it accountable when it fails. What happened to me last night was wrong, but the question now is whether the system will correct itself, or whether it will protect the officers who violated their oaths and my rights." As dawn broke over Richmond and filtered through the small window of their cell, Darius prepared himself for what would likely be the most important arraignment of his judicial career, except this time he would be standing in the defendant's box rather than sitting behind the bench. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. The man who had spent his career ensuring that defendants received fair hearings was about to test whether the system would extend the same courtesy to him. The officers who had arrested him would eventually have to explain their actions under oath, and the prosecutor who had filed charges would have to present evidence to support them. But Darius also understood that his position as a judge gave him advantages that most defendants did not have. He had resources, connections, and knowledge that would help him fight the charges. The real test would be whether his experience would lead to systemic changes that would benefit all defendants, or whether it would be dismissed as an isolated incident that didn't require broader reform. As he heard footsteps approaching the cell and keys jingling in the lock, Darius stood and straightened his wrinkled suit as much as possible. It was time to face the system as a defendant rather than a judge, and the lessons he learned would shape the rest of his career and the lives of everyone who would appear before him in the years to come. The Richmond City Courthouse buzzed with unusual activity on the morning of Judge Darius Coleman's arraignment. Word of his arrest had spread quickly through the legal community, creating a media circus that transformed what should have been a routine hearing into a spectacle that attracted attorneys, court personnel, journalists, and civil rights activists from across the region. David Martinez, the ACLU attorney who had agreed to represent Darius, arrived at the courthouse 2 hours before the scheduled hearing to prepare for what he knew would be one of the most high-profile cases of his career. Martinez was a seasoned civil rights lawyer with 15 years of experience fighting police misconduct and systemic racism in the criminal justice system. He had handled cases involving wrongful arrests, excessive force, and racial profiling, but he had never represented a sitting judge who had been arrested by officers who refused to believe his identity. Martinez was a compact man in his early 40s with graying temples and the kind of intense focus that came from years of fighting uphill battles against institutional power. He had grown up in California as the son of immigrant parents who had instilled in him a deep commitment to justice and equality. Law school at Berkeley had radicalized him politically, and 15 years of practice had only strengthened his belief that the legal system required constant vigilance to prevent it from becoming a tool of oppression rather than justice. As Martinez reviewed the police reports and booking documents, he was struck by the complete lack of evidence supporting the charges against his client. The arresting officers had provided no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no coherent explanation for why they had refused to verify Darius's identity through the simple expedient of calling the courthouse. Their reports were filled with vague accusations and unsupported claims that would never survive scrutiny in an actual trial. Officer Matthews's report claimed that Darius had been acting suspiciously and had provided false identification when questioned. Officer Daniels's report largely echoed his partner's account, with minor variations that actually created inconsistencies rather than corroborating the basic narrative. Neither report mentioned the multiple forms of identification Darius had provided, the business cards with courthouse contact information, or the briefcase full of official court documents. More troubling was the complete absence of any attempt to verify Darius's identity before making the arrest. The reports made no mention of calling the courthouse, checking with supervisors, or taking any of the basic investigative steps that would have immediately confirmed that Darius was exactly who he claimed to be. Martinez had handled enough police misconduct cases to recognize the pattern. Officers had made assumptions based on racial bias, had escalated a routine encounter into a confrontation, and were now trying to justify their actions through after-the-fact report writing that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred. At 8:30 a.m., Martinez met with Darius in a small conference room adjacent to the courthouse lockup. Darius had been transported from the city jail in shackles and an orange jumpsuit, the standard treatment for all defendants regardless of the charges against them or their position in the community. "Judge Coleman," Martinez said as they shook hands, "I've reviewed the charges and the police reports, and I have to tell you that this is one of the weakest cases I've ever seen. The officers have no evidence, no witnesses, and no credible explanation for their actions." Darius nodded, his expression showing the strain of spending a night in jail, but his voice remaining steady and professional. "David, I appreciate you taking this case on such short notice. What's our strategy for the arraignment?" Martinez opened his file and spread the documents across the small table. "First, we're going to enter a plea of not guilty and demand immediate dismissal of all charges based on lack of evidence. Second, we're going to request an investigation into the conduct of the arresting officers. Third, we're going to make it clear that this case is about more than just false charges. It's about a pattern of police misconduct that affects the entire community." They spent the next 30 minutes reviewing the details of Darius's arrest and discussing the legal and strategic options available. Martinez was impressed by his client's composure and analytical approach to the situation. qualities that would serve them well in the legal battle ahead. "Judge," Martinez said as they concluded their preparation, "I have to ask, are you prepared for the media attention this case is going to generate? Your arrest is already being covered by local news, and I expect national outlets will pick up the story before the day is over." Darius considered the question carefully. "David, I've spent my career trying to ensure that the system works fairly for everyone who appears before me. If my experience can help expose the problems that ordinary defendants face every day, then the media attention will be worth it." At 9 a.m., the arraignment was called to order in Courtroom 5, presided over by Judge Margaret Stone, who had served on the Richmond bench for 20 years and was widely respected for her fairness and integrity. Judge Stone was a tall, dignified woman in her early 60s whose gray hair and serious demeanor reflected the gravity she brought to every case that appeared before her. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with reporters filling the gallery, attorneys lining the walls, and court personnel crowding around the periphery to witness an unprecedented event. In the front row sat Chief Judge Elizabeth Stone, who had come to observe the proceedings involving one of her colleagues and several other judges who had cleared their calendars to attend. As Darius was led into the courtroom in shackles, a murmur rippled through the gallery. Many of the attorneys present had argued cases before him, and seeing him in defendant's clothing was jarring and surreal. The transformation from respected jurist to criminal defendant served as a stark reminder of how quickly circumstances could change and how vulnerable everyone was to the arbitrary exercise of police power. The prosecution was represented by Assistant District Attorney Robert Harrison, a career prosecutor in his mid-40s who had been assigned the case less than 12 hours earlier. Harrison was competent but not particularly imaginative, the kind of prosecutor who preferred routine cases with solid evidence rather than high-profile matters that required creative legal arguments. Harrison had spent most of the previous evening and early morning trying to understand how two experienced police officers had managed to arrest a sitting judge without recognizing him or verifying his identity. The case file contained no evidence that would support prosecution, and Harrison was beginning to understand that his role in the proceeding would be damage control rather than zealous advocacy. "Your Honor," Judge Stone began, "this is the case of Commonwealth versus Darius Coleman, charged with impersonating a public official, providing false information to a police officer, and obstruction of justice. Mr. Martinez, how does your client plead?" Martinez rose from the defense table, his voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "Your Honor, Judge Coleman pleads not guilty to all charges. Furthermore, we move for immediate dismissal of all charges based on the complete lack of evidence supporting the prosecution's case." A murmur went through the gallery at the use of Darius's judicial title, a reminder that the defendant was not just any citizen, but a respected member of the legal community who was being prosecuted by the same system he had served faithfully for 5 years. Judge Stone turned to the prosecution table. "Mr. Harrison, please present the Commonwealth's evidence supporting these charges." Harrison stood slowly, clearly uncomfortable with his position. "Your Honor, the defendant was arrested by Officers Matthews and Daniels after he allegedly provided false identification and claimed to be a judge. The officers determined that his claims were not credible and arrested him for impersonating a public official." Martinez was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, I object to the prosecution's characterization of the evidence. The defendant provided multiple forms of valid identification, including a driver's license, business cards with courthouse contact information, and a briefcase containing official court documents. At no time did the officers attempt to verify his identity through any of the obvious means available to them." Judge Stone reviewed the police reports, her expression growing more skeptical with each page. "Mr. Harrison, according to these reports, the defendant provided identification showing his name as Darius Coleman and business cards identifying him as a circuit court judge. Did the officers make any attempt to verify this information? Harrison shuffled through his papers, clearly searching for some evidence that would support the prosecution's case. Your Honor, the officers used their training and experience to determine that the defendant's claims were not credible. That's not what I asked, Mr. Harrison, Judge Stone replied sharply. I asked whether they made any attempt to verify the defendant's identity. Did they call the courthouse? Did they check with their supervisors? Did they take any investigative steps beyond deciding that they didn't believe him? The silence that followed Harrison's inability to answer spoke volumes about the quality of the police work that had led to the charges. Judge Stone's expression made it clear that she was not impressed by the prosecution's case or the conduct of the arresting officers. Martinez sensed an opportunity and pressed his advantage. Your Honor, not only did the officers fail to verify Judge Coleman's identity, but they refused to do so even when he specifically offered them multiple ways to confirm his status. This was not a case of mistaken identity or reasonable suspicion. This was a case of officers who made assumptions based on racial bias and then refused to consider evidence that contradicted those assumptions. The courtroom fell silent as Martinez's words hung in the air. The suggestion that the arrest had been racially motivated transformed the case from a simple misunderstanding into an indictment of systemic problems within law enforcement. Judge Stone leaned forward, her attention now fully focused on the fundamental issues raised by the case. Mr. Martinez, are you alleging that this arrest was motivated by racial bias? Yes, Your Honor, I am, Martinez replied without hesitation. Judge Coleman is a respected member of this court, known to law enforcement throughout this jurisdiction. He was arrested while walking home from work, well-dressed and carrying official court documents, after providing valid identification and offering multiple ways to verify his status. The only explanation for the officers' refusal to believe him is that they could not accept that a black man could legitimately hold a position of authority. The gallery erupted in quiet conversation as people processed the implications of Martinez's argument. Several reporters were typing furiously on their phones, understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would resonate far beyond the Richmond courthouse. Harrison attempted to object. Your Honor, the prosecution objects to counsel's inflammatory characterization of the officer's motives. There is no evidence that race played any role in this arrest. Martinez was ready with his response. Your Honor, the evidence is in what didn't happen as much as what did happen. These officers had multiple opportunities to verify Judge Coleman's identity, and they chose not to take advantage of any of them. They arrested a sitting judge based on nothing more than their refusal to believe that he was who he claimed to be. Judge Stone had heard enough. Mr. Harrison, I'm going to ask you directly. What evidence does the Commonwealth have to support these charges beyond the officers' assertion that they didn't believe the defendant's identification? Harrison looked through his files one more time, searching for something that would support prosecution, but finding nothing. Your Honor, the case rests primarily on the officers' testimony about the defendant's behavior and their assessment of his credibility. In other words, Judge Stone said, you have no evidence. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge Stone reviewed the charges and the evidence one more time. When she looked up, her expression left no doubt about her assessment of the case. Mr. Harrison, she said, I have been on this bench for 20 years, and I have never seen a weaker case presented for prosecution. The defendant provided valid identification, offered multiple ways to verify his status, and was arrested anyway based on nothing more than the arresting officer's refusal to believe him. She turned her attention to the defense table. Judge Coleman, please stand. Darius rose, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the judicial robes he normally wore, but his dignity intact despite the circumstances. Judge Coleman, Judge Stone continued, I want to apologize on behalf of this court for the treatment you have received. The charges against you are completely without merit, and I am dismissing them immediately. The courtroom erupted in applause, with attorneys, court personnel, and observers showing their approval for a decision that vindicated not only Darius personally, but the principle that the justice system should be based on evidence rather than prejudice. But Judge Stone was not finished. "Furthermore," she said, raising her voice to quiet the courtroom, "I am ordering a complete investigation into the conduct of Officers Matthews and Daniels. Their behavior in this case represents a serious breach of their oath and a violation of Judge Coleman's constitutional rights." She looked directly at Harrison. "Mr. Harrison, I expect the District Attorney's Office to cooperate fully with this investigation and to consider whether criminal charges are appropriate against the officers involved." Martinez stood to address the court. "Your Honor, Judge Coleman intends to file a federal civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the city, and we will be requesting a Department of Justice investigation into patterns of misconduct within the Richmond Police Department." As the hearing concluded and Darius was released from custody, he was surrounded by reporters, attorneys, and supporters who had come to witness his vindication. But even as he savored his freedom and the dismissal of the charges, he understood that his ordeal was far from over. The officers who had arrested him would now face their own legal battles, and the case would likely generate enough publicity to spark broader conversations about police accountability and racial bias in law enforcement. More importantly, Darius's experience as a defendant had given him insights that would influence his approach to every case that appeared before him in the future. As he walked out of the courthouse, a free man, still wearing the orange jumpsuit that had marked him as a defendant rather than a judge, Darius understood that his arrest had been more than just a personal injustice. It had been an education in how the system looked from the other side of the bench, and that education would make him a better judge and a stronger advocate for justice. 3 weeks after his release, Judge Darius Coleman sat in the conference room of Martinez and Associates, surrounded by boxes of documents, legal briefs, and evidence that would form the foundation of one of the most significant civil rights cases Richmond had seen in decades. The transformation from defendant back to his normal life had been jarring, returning to his courtroom, resuming his judicial duties, and trying to maintain objectivity while processing his own experience as a victim of police misconduct. David Martinez had assembled a team of civil rights attorneys to handle the federal lawsuit against Officers Matthews and Daniels, as well as the city of Richmond. The case would be filed in the Eastern District of Virginia, where it would be heard by federal judges who understood the constitutional issues at stake and the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for violations of citizens' rights. "Judge Coleman," Martinez said as they reviewed the complaint one final time before filing, "I want you to understand what we're up against here. The officers will claim they were acting in good faith based on their training and experience. The city will argue that this was an isolated incident that doesn't reflect systemic problems, and the police union will do everything possible to portray you as someone who was uncooperative or threatening during the arrest." Darius nodded, understanding the challenges they faced. "David, I've been thinking about this case not just as a victim seeking justice, but as a judge who has seen how these issues play out in courtrooms across the country. We need to do more than just win monetary damages. We need to create precedent that will protect other people from experiencing what I went through." The federal complaint they filed was comprehensive and damning, alleging violations of Darius's 4th and 14th Amendment rights, as well as violations of federal civil rights statutes that made it illegal for police officers to deprive citizens of their constitutional rights while acting under color of law. The document detailed not only the specific events of Darius's arrest, but also the pattern of complaints and misconduct allegations that had followed Matthews and Daniels throughout their careers. Martinez had spent weeks investigating the background of both officers, uncovering a trail of citizen complaints, internal affairs investigations, and civil settlements that painted a picture of officers who had repeatedly crossed the line between legitimate law enforcement and abuse of authority. The research revealed that Matthews had been the subject of 12 formal complaints during his 8-year career, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling to dishonesty in police reports. Most of these complaints had been dismissed after cursory investigations, often because complainants were reluctant to pursue formal charges or because supervisors were hesitant to discipline officers without overwhelming evidence. Daniels had a similar record, with 8 complaints during his 7-year career and a pattern of behavior that suggested he was willing to participate in or cover up his partner's misconduct. Together, the 2 officers had cost the city over $200,000 in settlements and legal fees related to previous incidents, yet both had received only minor disciplinary actions that did nothing to change their behavior. The lawsuit sought not only monetary damages for the violation of Darius's rights, but also injunctive relief that would require the city to implement comprehensive reforms to its police training, supervision, and accountability systems. Martinez understood that systemic problems required systemic solutions and that winning this case could create changes that would benefit the entire community. As word of the lawsuit spread through the legal community and the media, it attracted attention from civil rights organizations across the country. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund offered to file an amicus brief supporting the case, and the American Civil Liberties Union provided additional resources for the investigation into police misconduct patterns. But the case also generated pushback from law enforcement organizations and their political supporters. The Richmond Police Benevolent Association issued a statement defending Matthews and Daniels, claiming that they had acted reasonably under difficult circumstances and that the lawsuit was an attack on all police officers who put their lives on the line to protect the community. Police Chief Robert Davis found himself caught in the middle of a controversy that threatened to overshadow years of reform efforts and community outreach. Davis was a 30-year veteran who had worked hard to improve relations between his department and the communities it served, implementing body cameras, cultural sensitivity training, and community policing initiatives designed to build trust and reduce confrontations. The Matthews-Daniels incident represented everything Davis had been working to eliminate from his department. The officer's conduct had been unprofessional, unconstitutional, and completely contrary to the values he was trying to instill in his force. But he also understood that publicly criticizing his own officers would create morale problems and political backlash that could undermine his broader reform efforts. In a carefully worded statement, Chief Davis acknowledged that the incident raised serious questions about police procedures and officer training, while stopping short of condemning Matthews and Daniels directly. The Richmond Police Department is committed to serving all citizens with professionalism and respect for constitutional rights, the statement read. We take all allegations of misconduct seriously and will cooperate fully with any investigation into this incident. The internal affairs investigation that had been ordered by Judge Stone was being conducted by Lieutenant Sandra Mitchell, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for thoroughness and integrity. Mitchell had investigated dozens of misconduct cases during her career, but she had never dealt with a situation where officers had arrested a sitting judge without recognizing him or attempting to verify his identity. Mitchell's preliminary investigation had confirmed what Martinez had suspected. Matthews and Daniels had violated multiple departmental policies during Darius's arrest. They had failed to follow proper identification procedures, had used excessive force in making the arrest, and had filed reports that contained false or misleading information about what had actually occurred. More troubling was the pattern of behavior that emerged when Mitchell reviewed the officers' previous cases. Both men had a history of targeting black citizens for minor infractions, using aggressive tactics that often escalated routine encounters into confrontations, and filing reports that portrayed their actions in the most favorable light possible while minimizing or omitting information that might raise questions about their conduct. The investigation also revealed that supervisors had been aware of problems with both officers, but had failed to take meaningful action to address their behavior. Citizen complaints had been dismissed or downgraded, and both officers had received only minor disciplinary actions despite accumulating substantial numbers of complaints and costing the city significant amounts in legal settlements. 6 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Matthews and Daniels were formally terminated from the Richmond Police Department. The termination hearing was held in a conference room at police headquarters, with union representatives present to ensure that proper procedures were followed. Chief Davis presided over the hearing, his expression grim as he reviewed the findings of the internal affairs investigation. "Officers Matthews and Daniels," he began, "you are here because your conduct during the arrest of Judge Coleman violated departmental policy, constitutional principles, and the oath you took when you became police officers." Matthews made one final attempt to defend his actions. "Chief, we were acting on our training and experience. We had every right to arrest someone we believed was impersonating a public official." Chief Davis shook his head. "Officer Matthews, Judge Coleman provided you with valid identification, business cards with courthouse contact information, and offered multiple ways to verify his identity. Your failure to take any of these steps cannot be explained by training or experience. It can only be explained by willful disregard for proper procedures and constitutional requirements." The termination was unanimous, and both officers were escorted from the building by security personnel. Their badges, weapons, and department identification were confiscated, and they were informed that they were barred from returning to police property except for official business related to ongoing investigations. But losing their jobs was only the beginning of the consequences Matthews and Daniels would face. The Department of Justice had opened its own investigation into the incident, examining whether federal civil rights charges should be filed against both officers. Federal prosecution of police officers was relatively rare, but the high-profile nature of the case and the clear evidence of constitutional violations made it likely that charges would be forthcoming. The media coverage of the case had been extensive and largely sympathetic to Darius, but it had also generated broader conversations about police accountability and the treatment of black citizens by law enforcement. The story had been picked up by national outlets, and Darius found himself invited to speak at conferences and forums about his experience and the need for criminal justice reform. In one particularly powerful interview with CNN, Darius spoke about how his arrest had changed his perspective on the cases that appeared in his courtroom. "For 5 years," he said, "I heard defendants claim that they had been treated unfairly by police officers, and while I tried to be fair and objective, I had no personal experience with the kind of bias and misconduct they described. Now I understand what they were talking about, and it has made me a more skeptical and more careful judge." The interview resonated with viewers across the country, particularly in black communities where stories of police misconduct were common but rarely received national attention. Darius's status as a judge gave his story credibility and visibility that similar incidents involving ordinary citizens rarely achieved. As the civil rights lawsuit moved through the federal court system, Martinez and his team continued to uncover evidence of systemic problems within the Richmond Police Department. Their investigation revealed that Matthews and Daniels were not isolated bad actors, but part of a broader culture that tolerated and sometimes encouraged aggressive policing tactics that disproportionately affected minority communities. The evidence included statistical analysis showing that black drivers were 3 times more likely to be stopped by Richmond police than white drivers, and that black defendants were more likely to be arrested for minor offenses that white defendants typically received warnings for. Internal communications between officers contained language that suggested racial bias was not just tolerated but encouraged within certain units of the department. This evidence would become crucial not just for Darius's individual case, but for broader efforts to reform policing practices in Richmond and similar communities across the country. The lawsuit was no longer just about one judge's bad experience. It had become a vehicle for addressing systemic problems that affected thousands of citizens who didn't have the resources or visibility to fight back against police misconduct. As Darius returned to his regular duties on the bench, he found that his experience as a defendant had fundamentally changed his approach to criminal cases. He was more likely to question police testimony when it seemed inconsistent or incomplete, more willing to suppress evidence when constitutional violations had occurred, and more sensitive to the ways that racial bias could infect every stage of the criminal justice process. His colleagues on the bench had mixed reactions to his new approach. Some supported his increased scrutiny of police conduct, understanding that his experience had given him valuable insights into problems that needed to be addressed. Others worried that he had become biased against law enforcement and might not be able to fairly evaluate cases involving police officers. Judge Stone, the chief judge who had supported Darius throughout his ordeal, called him into her chambers for a frank discussion about his future on the bench. "Darius," she said, "I understand that your experience has changed your perspective, and I think that can make you a better judge. But you need to be careful not to let your personal experience prevent you from being fair to everyone who appears in your courtroom, including police officers who are doing their jobs properly." Darius appreciated her concern and understood the delicate balance he needed to maintain. "Judge Stone," he replied, "my experience has made me more aware of the potential for abuse, but it has also reinforced my commitment to following the law and protecting everyone's constitutional rights. I don't think that makes me biased. I think it makes me better informed." As the months passed and the federal lawsuit continued to move through the court system, Darius found himself becoming a reluctant symbol of the broader struggle for police accountability and racial justice. He spoke at law schools, testified before legislative committees, and participated in conferences focused on criminal justice reform. But he never forgot that his experience, while traumatic and life-changing, had been relatively brief compared to what many other citizens endured on a regular basis. His status as a judge had ultimately protected him from the worst consequences of police misconduct, and his resources and connections had allowed him to fight back in ways that were not available to most people who found themselves in similar situations. The real test of the case would not be whether Darius received monetary compensation for his ordeal, but whether the lawsuit would create lasting changes that would protect other citizens from experiencing similar violations of their rights. That outcome would depend not just on winning in court, but on maintaining the political and social pressure needed to implement and enforce meaningful reforms. As Darius prepared for the next phase of his legal battle, he understood that his arrest had been more than just a personal injustice. It had been a wake-up call for a community and a legal system that had allowed problematic policing practices to continue for too long. The question now was whether his experience would be enough to create the changes that were desperately needed, or whether it would be dismissed as an isolated incident that didn't require broader reform. 8 months after his arrest, Judge Darius Coleman sat in his chambers preparing for what would be one of the most unusual and emotionally challenging days of his judicial career. The federal civil rights lawsuit against officers Matthews and Daniels was proceeding through the court system, but today would bring a different kind of confrontation, one that he had not anticipated but that seemed inevitable given the strange circumstances of his case. Through a quirk of court scheduling and judicial assignments, officers Matthews and Daniels were scheduled to appear in his courtroom as witnesses in an unrelated criminal case. The defendant, a young man named Marcus Thompson, was facing drug possession charges based primarily on testimony from the 2 officers who had arrested Judge Coleman 8 months earlier. The irony of the situation was not lost on anyone involved. The same officers who had refused to believe that Darius was a judge would now have to testify before him in his official capacity, answering questions about their credibility and their adherence to proper procedures. The defense attorney in the Thompson case had specifically requested that the officers' misconduct in the Coleman case be considered as evidence of their lack of credibility as witnesses. Judge Coleman had spent considerable time consulting with judicial ethics experts about whether he should recuse himself from the case. The ethical considerations were complex, involving questions about whether his personal experience with the officers would prevent him from being impartial, whether his knowledge of their misconduct was relevant to their credibility as witnesses, and whether his continued service on cases involving these officers would create the appearance of bias or vindictiveness. After careful consideration and consultation with Chief Judge Stone, Darius had decided to proceed with the case while making full disclosure of his history with the officers. His reasoning was that recusal would actually harm the interests of justice by preventing a judge with first-hand knowledge of the officers' credibility problems from properly evaluating their testimony. As court convened at 9 a.m., the gallery was packed with reporters, attorneys, and legal observers who had come to witness what promised to be an unprecedented confrontation between a judge and the officers who had arrested him. The atmosphere in the courtroom was tense, with everyone understanding that they were about to witness something that had never happened before in the American judicial system. Marcus Thompson, the defendant, sat at the defense table next to his attorney, public defender Sarah Williams. Williams was the experienced criminal defense attorney who had represented dozens of clients in cases involving testimony from Matthews and Daniels. She had long suspected that both officers had credibility problems, but she had never had the evidence to prove it until Judge Coleman's arrest provided clear documentation of their willingness to fabricate charges and lie in official reports. The prosecution was represented by Assistant District Attorney Michael Crawford, a young prosecutor who had been assigned the case after several more senior attorneys had asked to be removed due to the unusual circumstances. Crawford understood that prosecuting a case based primarily on testimony from officers who had been terminated for misconduct would be extremely difficult, but he was committed to following the evidence wherever it led. As Judge Coleman entered the courtroom and took his position behind the bench, he could see officers Matthews and Daniels sitting in the witness area, both men looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact with him. The transformation in their demeanor was striking. Gone was the swagger and aggressive confidence they had displayed during his arrest, replaced by the nervous uncertainty of people who understood that their actions had consequences. "This is the case of Commonwealth versus Marcus Thompson," Judge Coleman began, his voice carrying the same authority it always had despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Before we proceed, I need to make a disclosure to all parties and place it on the record." The courtroom fell silent as everyone waited to hear how Judge Coleman would address his history with the key witnesses in the case. The Commonwealth's primary witnesses in this case are Officers Ryan Matthews and Craig Daniels of the Richmond Police Department, Judge Coleman continued. "I need to inform all parties that I have personal knowledge of these officers' conduct that may be relevant to their credibility as witnesses. 8 months ago, Officers Matthews and Daniels arrested me on fabricated charges after refusing to verify my identity despite multiple opportunities to do so. Those charges were subsequently dismissed, both officers were terminated from the police department, and they are currently facing federal civil rights charges for their conduct." A murmur rippled through the gallery as Judge Coleman laid out the facts with the clinical precision of someone determined to be completely transparent about potential conflicts. "I have consulted with the Judicial Ethics Advisory Committee about whether I should recuse myself from this case," Judge Coleman continued. "The consensus opinion is that my personal knowledge of the officers' credibility problems may actually be relevant to the fair adjudication of this case, and that recusal would not serve the interests of justice. Both parties have the right to object to my continued participation in this case, and I will respect any such objection." Defense Attorney Williams was the first to respond. "Your Honor, the defense has no objection to your continued participation in this case. In fact, we believe your first-hand knowledge of the witness's credibility issues is crucial to ensuring a fair trial for our client." Prosecutor Crawford looked distinctly uncomfortable as he stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the Commonwealth appreciates the court's transparency. However, we are concerned that your personal experience with the officers may create the appearance of bias against the prosecution's case. Judge Coleman nodded, understanding the prosecutor's dilemma. Mr. Crawford, I want to assure you that my evaluation of the officer's testimony will be based solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom and the legal standards that govern witness credibility. My personal experience will not influence my rulings except to the extent that it provides relevant context for evaluating their truthfulness and reliability. With the disclosure complete, the trial proceeded to opening arguments. Williams made it clear that her defense would focus heavily on the credibility problems of the officers, while Crawford attempted to argue that their testimony in the Thompson case should be evaluated independently of any misconduct in other matters. When Officer Matthews was called as the Commonwealth's first witness, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. As he walked to the witness stand, his eyes briefly met Judge Coleman's, and both men understood that they were about to engage in a confrontation that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed 8 months earlier. Matthews was sworn in by the bailiff, raising his right hand and promising to tell the truth, an oath that carried particular weight given his history of dishonesty in official reports and court testimony. Prosecutor Crawford began his direct examination with routine questions about Matthews' background and training, trying to establish his credibility as a law enforcement professional. But the foundation of his testimony was immediately undermined by the elephant in the room. Everyone in the courtroom knew that this officer had been terminated for misconduct and was facing federal charges for violating a citizen's civil rights. "Officer Matthews," Crawford asked, "please describe your encounter with the defendant on the night in question." Matthews cleared his throat and began recounting his version of events, claiming that he and his partner had observed Thompson engaging in what appeared to be a drug transaction. According to his testimony, they had approached Thompson, who had immediately become belligerent and tried to flee before being apprehended with illegal substances in his possession. Defense Attorney Williams listened carefully to Matthews' testimony, taking notes and preparing for what she knew would be a devastating cross-examination. She had reviewed the police reports, witness statements, and physical evidence, and she had identified multiple inconsistencies that would undermine Matthews's credibility. When Crawford finished his direct examination, Williams rose for cross-examination with the confidence of an attorney who knew she held all the cards. "Officer Matthews," she began, "you testified that you observed my client engaging in what appeared to be a drug transaction. Can you describe exactly what you saw?" Matthews provided a detailed account of Thompson allegedly exchanging money for what appeared to be drugs, but his description was vague and inconsistent with other evidence in the case. Williams pressed further. "Officer Matthews, according to your police report, this alleged transaction took place at 9:30 p.m. on a well-lit street corner. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct. But according to the surveillance video from the nearby convenience store, which we will be introducing as evidence, my client was inside that store making a purchase at 9:30 p.m. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Matthews appeared flustered, clearly not expecting to be confronted with video evidence that contradicted his testimony. The times in police reports are sometimes approximations. The transaction could have taken place a few minutes earlier or later." Williams smiled, knowing that she had caught him in the first of what would be many inconsistencies. "Officer Matthews, your report states specifically that the transaction occurred at 9:30 p.m. Are you now changing your testimony?" Judge Coleman watched the exchange with professional interest, noting how Matthews's discomfort and evasiveness mirrored his behavior during the arrest 8 months earlier. The officer's willingness to shade the truth or outright lie when confronted with contradictory evidence was becoming apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Williams continued her systematic destruction of Matthews' credibility, exposing inconsistencies in his report, gaps in his investigation, and his failure to follow proper procedures during Thompson's arrest. With each question, it became more apparent that Matthews had either been careless in his police work or had deliberately fabricated elements of his account. The climax of the cross-examination came when Williams addressed Matthews' termination from the police department. "Officer Matthews," she said, "you are no longer employed by the Richmond Police Department, is that correct?" Matthews shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's correct. And you were terminated for misconduct, specifically for violating a citizen's constitutional rights during an arrest, is that correct?" Crawford objected, arguing that Matthews' employment status was not relevant to the current case, but Judge Coleman overruled the objection. "The witness's credibility is always relevant," Judge Coleman ruled, "and evidence of dishonesty or misconduct by law enforcement officers is particularly relevant to evaluating their testimony." Williams continued, "Officer Matthews, you were terminated after you arrested Judge Darius Coleman on fabricated charges. Is that correct?" Matthews looked directly at Judge Coleman for the first time since taking the witness stand, understanding that there was no way to avoid acknowledging what had happened between them. "Yes," he said quietly. "And during that arrest, you refused to verify Judge Coleman's identity despite multiple opportunities to do so. Is that correct?" "I was following proper procedures." "Officer Matthews," Williams interrupted, "please just answer the question. Did you refuse to verify Judge Coleman's identity?" "Yes." "And you filed police reports that contained false information about Judge Coleman's behavior during that arrest. Is that correct?" Matthews was silent for a long moment, understanding that any answer would further damage his credibility. Finally, he spoke. "I reported what I believed to be accurate at the time," Matthews finally said, his voice low, but it carried enough for the jury to hear. Williams raised an eyebrow. "Accurate or convenient?" "Objection," Crawford said immediately. "Sustained," Judge Coleman replied, his tone clipped. Even as he granted the objection, there was no mistaking the coldness in his gaze toward Matthews. Williams nodded slightly, pivoting to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just heard the witness admit to falsifying a report involving the very judge presiding over this case. You can draw your own conclusions about credibility." Matthews shifted in the chair, his jaw tight. It was clear he wanted to say more, but any further comment would only dig the hole deeper. Williams returned to his table, flipping through her notes, but the damage was done. Every juror's eyes lingered on Matthews, as if silently weighing every word he had just spoken against the evidence they'd heard so far. Crawford stood for redirect, but his usual confidence had dimmed. He asked only 2 brief questions, both about procedural policy, and then released Matthews from the stand. As the officer stepped down, he avoided eye contact with the judge, his path to the exit deliberate and slow. The prosecution called its next witness, but the energy in the room had shifted. This wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about the integrity of the people involved. The new witness, Detective Carl Bennett, took the stand. A man in his late 40s with a precise, almost military posture, Bennett had a reputation for thoroughness. Unlike Matthews, he appeared unshakable at first glance. Williams approached. "Detective Bennett, you were the lead investigator on the incident in question, correct?" "Yes, ma'am." "You reviewed all reports submitted by Officer Matthews?" "I did." "And did you find any inconsistencies?" Bennett hesitated. "There were discrepancies." Williams stepped closer. "Discrepancies or outright falsehoods?" "Objection," Crawford said again, his tone sharper this time. "Overruled," Judge Coleman replied without pause. Bennett adjusted in his seat. "I found statements that did not match the evidence gathered." Williams leaned in just slightly. "Including statements about the defendant's alleged behavior?" "Yes." A faint ripple went through the courtroom, jurors glancing at one another, the gallery whispering under their breath. Williams let the silence hang for a moment, giving the weight of Bennett's answer room to sink in. "Detective Bennett, did you personally interview the defendant?" "I did." "And did their account match the physical evidence you recovered?" "Yes, it did." Williams nodded. No further questions. Crawford approached for cross-examination, his tone a shade too casual. "Detective Bennett, isn't it true that officers sometimes misinterpret events in the heat of the moment?" "Yes, that can happen." And isn't it possible that Officer Matthews simply made mistakes, not deliberate falsehoods? Bennett looked directly at him. Possible, yes. But the nature of the discrepancies suggested otherwise. The defense attorney froze for a split second, then shifted his line of questioning, but it was too late. The implication was planted. As the day wound to a close, Judge Coleman called for recess. The jury was dismissed and the attorneys began packing up their papers. Williams lingered by her table, watching as Matthews avoided everyone's gaze on his way out of the building. Bennett, on the other hand, stayed behind, speaking quietly with the prosecution. Out in the hallway, reporters swarmed, shouting questions about the officer's past misconduct. Matthews kept walking, jaw clenched, knowing tomorrow would bring more of the same, if not worse. Inside the courtroom, Judge Coleman sat alone for a moment after everyone had gone. His hands rested on the bench, his face unreadable. The past had an unrelenting way of catching up. And in this trial, it had done so publicly. Tomorrow's witnesses, and the cracks in the defense strategy, would test just how far the truth could push before someone in that room broke entirely. The following morning, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. News crews had arrived earlier than usual, their vans parked in a tight row along the curb. Overnight, clips of Matthews' testimony had aired on local stations, with commentators speculating about the impact his credibility issues would have on the jury. Inside, the tension was thicker than the stale coffee in the lobby. Jurors filed in, their expressions carefully neutral, but Williams noticed the subtle glances exchanged between them. She knew they had discussed yesterday's revelations in the privacy of the jury room, even if they were instructed not to. Judge Coleman took the bench. "We'll continue with the prosecution's case," he said. "Ms. Williams, call your next witness." Williams stood. The prosecution calls Maria Alvarez. A petite woman in her late 30s walked to the stand, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She moved with a mix of apprehension and determination. After being sworn in, she folded her hands in her lap, ready for the questions. "Ms. Alvarez, can you tell the court your connection to the events of August 14th? Williams asked. "I was working at the community center that day," Maria replied. "I saw the whole thing." Williams leaned on the podium. "When you say the whole thing, what exactly do you mean?" Maria took a breath. "I saw the defendant being stopped by Officer Matthews. I saw him ask the officer why he was being detained. Matthews didn't answer, just grabbed him and pushed him against the wall." The jurors leaned forward slightly. Williams nodded. "Did you observe any behavior from the defendant that could be considered aggressive or threatening toward Officer Matthews?" "No," Maria said firmly. "He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch the officer. He just asked why he was being stopped." Williams took a step closer. "And then what happened?" "Matthews put handcuffs on him. I heard the defendant say his name, his position, but the officer ignored him. That's when I went inside to get someone to record it." The courtroom murmured. Crawford quickly rose. "Objection, hearsay regarding the recording." "Overruled," Coleman said, his tone cool. "Continue, Ms. Alvarez." Maria looked directly at the jury. "When I came back, another officer had arrived, but Matthews still had the defendant pinned. They were ignoring what he was saying." Williams let the words hang, then nodded. "No further questions." Crawford rose, smoothing his tie. "Ms. Alvarez, you're not a law enforcement professional, are you?" "No." "So you wouldn't necessarily know what qualifies as an aggressive stance to an officer?" "I know what aggression looks like," Maria said, her voice sharp. "And I didn't see it that day." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Thank you. No further questions." She stepped down, her gaze steady, not once looking toward Matthews, who sat at the defense table with an expression carved from stone. By midday, the prosecution rested its case. The jury had heard about inconsistent reports, questionable arrests, and a key witness account that aligned with the defendant's version of events. Crawford now had the unenviable task of repairing the image of his primary witness while building reasonable doubt. When court resumed after lunch, Crawford called his first witness for the defense, Officer Matthews again. This time the atmosphere was heavier, as if everyone in the room knew the crossfire would be brutal. "Officer Matthews," Crawford began, "can you explain your thought process on August 14th? Matthews straightened. The area had seen a rise in suspicious activity. The defendant matched the description of a suspect we'd been briefed on. Crawford nodded. And when he didn't comply immediately, what did you do? I restrained him. That's what I was trained to do. And your reports, were they written with the intent to mislead? No, I wrote what I perceived. Crawford looked satisfied. No further questions. Williams stood. Officer Matthews, this description you mentioned, was it ever confirmed to match the defendant? No, Matthews admitted. And when the defendant identified himself, you still continued the arrest? Yes, at the time I didn't believe. You didn't believe him? Williams cut in. Or you didn't want to believe him? Objection, Crawford barked. Overruled, Coleman said, his voice steady. Matthews shifted uncomfortably. I made a judgment call. A judgment call, Williams repeated, turning to the jury. A call that ignored clear identification, violated constitutional rights, and resulted in falsified details in your report. That's your idea of proper procedure? Matthews' silence was the loudest answer in the room. The defense's case faltered after that. Their next two witnesses offered little to counter the prosecution's narrative. One was a fellow officer who spoke in vague terms about following protocol. The other was a character witness whose testimony crumbled under Williams' cross-examination. By the final day of testimony, even Crawford looked worn, his usual sharpness dulled by the uphill battle. Williams rose first. She spoke directly to the jury, weaving together the threads they had heard over the past week. The inconsistent reports, the credible eyewitness, the admissions on the stand. This case isn't just about one wrongful arrest, she said. It's about the trust you place in those given authority. When that trust is broken, there must be accountability. Crawford followed, trying to remind the jury of the chaos officer's face, the split-second decisions, but his words lacked the conviction that had carried his earlier trials. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson stood. We find the defendant not guilty on all charges. A quiet exhale rippled through the room. The defendant closed his eyes briefly, relief etched in his features. Matthews sat rigid, staring at the table. Crawford placed a hand on his shoulder, but the gesture felt more obligatory than supportive. Judge Coleman thanked the jury for their service, then adjourned. The trial was over, but the consequences were only beginning. The air outside the courthouse was sharp with early autumn chill, but the crowd that had gathered felt electric. Reporters jostled for position, microphones extended like spears toward the victors of the day. Williams stood just a step behind her client, allowing him the first words. It's over, the defendant said, voice steady but quiet. But this isn't the end of the story. For me, for others, there's still a long road ahead. Behind them, a ripple of camera flashes lit the steps like lightning. Williams took the podium. Her tone was measured, not celebratory. Today, a jury made clear that no one is above the law. Not an officer, not a department, not even a system that sometimes protects its own at the expense of the people. This verdict is justice for my client, but it's also a call to action. It was the kind of soundbite that would play on the evening news, clipped and replayed with headlines about reform and accountability. While the crowd outside buzzed with energy, Matthews slipped through the side exit, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. The city felt colder here, in the shadows where the press didn't wait. By the time he reached his car, he had already turned off his phone. Too many missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize, too many unread messages from former colleagues that were more curiosity than comfort. That night, he sat in his kitchen with the television muted, watching his own face flicker across the screen in grainy courtroom footage. They played the moment he admitted to refusing to verify the defendant's identity. They played Bennett's testimony about false statements. They played Maria Alvarez's calm, unwavering account. Every clip felt like a nail in the coffin of his career. Within a week, the department placed him on administrative leave pending a full review. A month later, the review concluded with a termination letter delivered in person by a deputy chief who couldn't look him in the eye. Matthews' pension would remain intact, one last technical mercy, but the badge, the gun, The quiet power he'd carried for over a decade, gone. Job offers didn't come. Even security firms hesitated, worried about optics. His name was now shorthand in local activist circles for everything wrong with the department. For Judge Darius Coleman, the verdict closed one door and cracked open another. The arrest that had ended Matthews' career was the same one that had humiliated Coleman years earlier. At the time, he had swallowed the injustice quietly, aware that public outrage might taint his own judicial credibility. But now, in the space between gavel strikes and closed chambers, he allowed himself to feel the vindication he'd never sought. Colleagues stopped by his office in the days after the trial, offering quiet nods and a few words that spoke volumes. You handled it well. Privately, he wondered if his ruling style would change. The trial had been a reminder that law, at its best, wasn't just about statutes and precedent. It was about people, about the damage a single act of arrogance could inflict. At night, he revisited the arrest in his mind, not out of bitterness, but as a study in how power distorts judgment. He told himself that if nothing else, this case might leave the city a little more cautious about who wore the uniform. For prosecutor Linda Williams, the case was both a professional triumph and a career pivot. Within days, her office was flooded with interview requests. Advocacy groups wanted her to speak at forums on police accountability. Law schools invited her to guest lecture, but along with the attention came scrutiny. Defense attorneys in other cases whispered that she'd built her reputation on one bad cop rather than a systemic issue. Williams knew better. Matthews wasn't the disease, he was a symptom. She began quietly meeting with community leaders, asking about patterns of misconduct, gaps in policy, places where the law turned a blind eye. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary. The verdict had given her a platform. What she did next would determine whether it was just a fleeting headline or the start of lasting change. Freedom didn't feel like it used to. The defendant returned to his job at the community organization, but the memory of that day, hands pinned, cuffs biting into skin, the cold disbelief in Matthew's eyes, never fully left him. People in the neighborhood treated him differently now. Some with admiration, seeing him as a symbol of resilience, others with caution, unsure how to talk about what had happened. He attended a few local council meetings where police reform was discussed, speaking quietly about his experience, not with anger, but with precision. He wanted people to understand that his case was rare, not because misconduct was rare, but because most people never got the chance to fight it in court. The department couldn't ignore the optics. The trial had pulled skeletons from closets they'd kept locked for years. Internal Affairs announced a review of use of force policies. Training modules were rewritten to emphasize de-escalation and citizen verification. A city councilman, sensing political opportunity, pushed for a civilian oversight committee with the authority to subpoena officers. The measure passed by a narrow margin. Even so, not everyone welcomed the changes. Some officers saw it as overreach, a stripping away of tools they believed necessary to do the job. Others left quietly, unwilling to adapt to the new scrutiny. For the public, the changes were both a victory and a test. Would the reforms stick, or would they fade once the cameras turned away? On the anniversary of the verdict, a small gathering formed on the courthouse steps. Williams, the defendant, Maria Alvarez, and a handful of others stood together, not for a press conference, but for a moment of quiet acknowledgement. Matthews wasn't there. By then, he had moved 2 counties over, working part-time at a shipping warehouse. His name rarely made the news anymore, but in certain circles it was still spoken like a cautionary tale. Coleman, watching from his chambers, saw them through the glass. He didn't go down to join them. Judges weren't in the habit of commemorating trials, but he allowed himself a rare smile. Justice, he knew, was never absolute. But sometimes it was enough to tip the scales back toward balance, even for a moment. In the end, the trial became more than a case number in the archives. It was a marker in the city's timeline, a point when people could say, that's when things started to change. And though the world moved on, the echoes of that verdict lingered in policy manuals, in community meetings, and in the cautious eyes of officers who now thought twice before ignoring a name, a badge, or a truth standing right in front of them.